we're back. Today I'm doing another post-mortem for one of my ludum-dare projects, this time for ludum-dare 47. The game is called File 47, An Incident in the Exclusion Zone. If you're watching this during the rating period and you haven't played the game, please play it first and rate it and then watch this. If this is after the rating period, you can go play it now. It's available on itch. It's playable in the browser. Real easy, fast to load. Try it out. What I'm going to talk about today is going to spoil everything about it. I'm going to dive into the design and stuff, so we should probably play that before watching this. So this is the game. It is a narrative, card-driven adventure puzzle game where you are moving through the world between various locations with this like deck of cards. You play as one of three different characters that you select at the beginning, who are each slightly different in their stats and what they're carrying with them. And as you move through the environment, you will make decisions. You will talk to people. You will encounter various challenges that use your skills. So you can see I am not doing particularly great at talking to these kids. Each time I take an action, that takes time. You can see the time at the top. And eventually, like in this case, I successfully beat that challenge, and now something in the world has changed. But time's always ticking. You have an inventory of cards here. These are items that you can use. You always start with one based on your character. But some of these you'll pick up along the way, and they will have various uses. Once you hit a certain point in the game, like a certain time in the world will kind of halt like this, and you are effectively teleported to this new state where people are talking to you. And it's a little vague and ambiguous about what that means, but people are communicating with you and telling you that you are in a time loop. So when I click through this little bit of story, the game resets back to 11 o'clock. So you're in a time loop, and you have a little bit of a vague, nebulous goal, and this is an open world. As you progress, you will acquire items and things, but you won't be able to carry those between runs effectively. But you can learn things along the way, and learning things will open up new paths in the game. So it's a little bit open-ended, it's a little bit exploratory, but eventually you are trying to figure out what is the source of this time loop and break out of it. There are a few puzzles in the game. There's kind of a few explicit like mini puzzles where they're kind of self-contained. There's maybe like 2 or 3 that are really like that. But because that challenge system, it's pretty open-ended in how you approach different solutions. Like in that previous example, it's like, well, this character isn't particularly good at talking to people, so maybe he should have found a different way to progress forward. Whereas another character is better at that, and that leads to different things. So as you explore the world, you kind of start to get a model of what you need to do, and you realize that time pressure is there to try to force you to come up with the efficient path to go further. Because on your first run through, and even your second run through, you will not be able to get all the way to the end. There isn't enough time, and you don't know enough. So you have to learn new things to open up new shortcuts to then, once you know enough, you can have one really good run to progress through to get all the way to the end. So I built this game solo in 72 hours for the jam, for this ludum-dare 47. And I built it by myself with only a tiny bit of pre-existing assets. Almost everything was built in that time, and the code was certainly all written in that time. The game is built in HTML with pixie.js and JavaScript, just those, no other frameworks or anything. But actually it is built in my own scripting language that is transpiled into JavaScript and has hooks into Pixie.js. And that was stuff that I had written before. That was not done in 72 hours. There's kind of a lot to unpack with that last bit, so let's start there. So this is the scripting language that I'm using, and like I said, it's something I built myself, and I don't have a name for it. Technically, it has a name, but I don't like the name, and it's still kind of a work in progress. It's obviously fairly fully featured. It was able to build this complicated game, but it's still very much a work in progress, and this is like one of the first big tests of the language is this project. This isn't the first time I've built like a scripting language for games. It's actually kind of the third attempt. Back a year ago, I built this game, Mini Minions, which was built using a kind of earlier iteration of this scripting language. As I continued to work on this game after the ludum-dare 40 whatever that was for, some of the cracks in that scripting language began to show, and I wanted to kind of start from scratch and try some new things based on what I'd learned. So yeah, this isn't my first time really making a scripting language. It's something I like doing, building a programming language from scratch. But I don't want to spend too much time on that now. It's kind of a whole other thing, and I really want to focus on the game design now. So coming into this ludum-dare, I had some code written to kind of create a little bit of a game engine in JavaScript, and I had some basic controls written. I was kind of working on another project as like a prototype for this scripting language, and so I'd written enough code to lay out a hex grid that was like zoomable and had some interactions, and a system for laying out, like rendering cards, laying them out on screen, and having like a interactive hand of cards. And I really wanted to use the scripting language. I thought it was ready. I'd done enough testing. That was kind of a problem on previous round, was I was not ready. But this time I was fairly confident, like, yep, I have all the things in place, and I have enough to do maybe a very small scope of game, but I can definitely do it. So with the final set of themes for this ludum-dare, I had a short list of kind of ideas for like what I could do that were safe to do with this scripting language, and there were just a couple themes where it was like, well, if that's the theme that's picked, then I'm going to just use the technology I'm really familiar with and the monogame C# game engine that I've been developing for 10 years and just hammer something out, mainly because those would fit game ideas that I've had for a long time and really want to explore, and I've just never had a good excuse to do it. But that was only a couple of projects. Most of them, I really wanted to focus on this, and so I had kind of a vague idea for a number of them that I could do something with the cards specifically, as opposed to the hex grid that I had, but something with the cards, and maybe something like a narrative game, a little bit like Reigns, or something like that, where you are presented like a card and you have a choice of what you want to do, and you can choose to go down path A or path B, and if you do path B, that puts a card in the future, like something you know is going to happen later because you're taking this action now. And so I thought that's kind of a framework that like I think I have the tools to do. It's the right scope. A lot of the details are really fuzzy, but I can figure that out in 48 or 72 hours. So the final theme was announced, and it's Stuck in a Loop. And that was one of the ones I was excited about. I thought there were some ideas there that I would like to explore. I'm starting to realize now maybe a lot of other people had similar ideas that they wanted to explore, but I'd written down just a couple of ideas in advance of, I could do a adventure game, like a time loop, where you go through this series of events and you learn new things and can explore new places, and you need to solve some sort of overall puzzle. I had not thought very hard about these ideas. It was just like, oh yeah, I can do that. I'm sure I can do that. I haven't thought about it. It's fine. I might have been a little overly optimistic, perhaps. The ideas I had were basically just settings for some sort of time loop, and in retrospect, those couple of ideas were maybe not the most original or exciting. It was, what if a space station, and then an explosion happens, and time resets? What if a remote alpine lodge stuck in the snow, and then an explosion happens and a time loop happens. So there's just a couple of ideas like that I had going into this, and once I kind of thought a little bit more about it, I was like, well, those are maybe good, but they're maybe a little generic. I wasn't super happy with them, and so I explored other possibilities, and one of the ideas that I came up with was like, well, what about an illegal cyberpunk street race? And for some reason that like really sparked my imagination, and like a lot of things kind of fell into place of like, oh yeah, like a street race, like you go through and eventually you're gonna have to get in that race and you're gonna have to like win it or something like that. There's some big unknowns about, well, why are you in a time loop? Important detail. And certain other things, but that one kind of like just sparked my imagination after the theme was announced, and I was like, yeah, let's go with that. So I want to talk a bit about the world design and kind of the puzzle box design, really. From the early designs, I had some ideas of where I would go. There would be a rooftop on like an apartment building or something where you would oversee this illegal race. There would be this race that you need to eventually participate in to get to some goal. And in order to participate, you would have to get one of the race cars, or, well, I pretty quickly settled on Trocket. I'll leave the details of what a Trocket is to the imagination, I think. But you have to win one of these Trockets from a person in the back of like a casino or like some sort of shady den of iniquity or something. So this is actually what the world looks like kind of once you realize you're in a time loop. Prior to that first run, you don't see most of the world. You're pretty limited. And that's kind of something I want to do, is like you have one run to kind of just get used to what is the goal for the character that you're playing as, and walk through a little bit of world building and stuff like that. So this is the actual like bit of the world that's exposed, and you have to go to the starting line to talk to some people to unlock traveling to this apartment, which then you can go up to the rooftop, and hopefully most players will get to the rooftop with enough time to watch the race, because this whole thing is like built around this central ticking clock mechanism. There's a little bit of a struggle there to try to get you focused to see that event, but I think that's important because that's actually a clue to the end, and it sets the stage and kind of sets the ticking clock sort of scenario a little bit. It makes it make more sense, I think. I was not as careful as I should have been. I probably should have kind of funneled you a little bit more into that, but I think most characters probably hit the top of the roof and watches the race, which locks you into getting to the end of the time loop. So once you know that you're in a time loop and now you are, trying to get out of it, a lot more things open up. There's a lot of these other paths. Some of these are still locked off. You can't simply go here, you can't simply go here, and eventually you do need to get up to here. So because of that original design where I wanted to have like a character going through this narrative adventure and there'd be stats and stuff, I knew I kind of wanted to still do some of that. I wanted to have items that you would pick up that would kind of help you in various ways along the way. I knew I wanted to have like a something like a challenge system, something that wasn't just a binary key and lock or anything so simple as that. And I knew I wanted to do multiple characters that had different attributes and different items and things like that. So it was a different experience for each of them. In retrospect, that might not have been the greatest idea because I don't really do anything with that. I don't encourage replayability, and I don't think this game makes a ton of sense to play twice. But because there is that first option of selecting a character, and because I was kind of thinking I would do that at least, I designed it in a way that it could be played. So there are a set of challenges, and there's different ones that make sense for different characters. So to line up with that, I also decided there would be 3 different stats that the characters would have, and each of the 3 characters would have an advantage in one of those areas. So I never wrote it down in the game. I always use icons, but it's like a fighting, agility, and charisma, more or less, is what those correlate to. So the way I designed this to work was I started with the student, which is good at charisma, and I made sure that that was kind of the primary path, but I always made sure that there was, as I was designing, another option that one of the other two characters could go to get to the same point. Because in some sense there are a couple of checkpoints, sort of, depending on the character, of things you learn about the world that make things easier. So for example, there's a bouncer at the garage, and you have a couple of options to deal with him. You can just fight him, but because of the way the skill system was implemented, it would have been basically impossible for most of the characters. You have to do something before you get to there, so maybe pick up a weapon or something. So for the student, their path would probably involve going to the apartment, talking to the kids that are hanging out in the stairwell, and then busting into the apartment where they leave a VR headset. It's part of the story. And then taking that VR headset back to the taxi driver that distracts the bouncer so you can sneak through. On the other hand, if you're playing as the boxer, you're probably going to run up to the rooftop, grab a baseball bat, and just go to town on the guy. If you're playing as the third character, you'll probably go pick up the brass knuckles and then maybe just go to town on the guy. But you also might instead take a different path and go to the basement directly. There's like a harder test that he is particularly good at to get in there. So there's multiple paths to get into this area. Then once you're in this area, I kind of expect most players will go to the casino and eventually get the VIP card. That gives you the code word to get past the bouncer. So then on your next run, it's much faster to get in here. You don't have to do any of those first steps. You can just walk up to him and say, hey, the code word is cucumber? I don't remember what the code word is. Cantaloupe. Code word is cantaloupe. And then you can get in here easier. And because you're on a time clock, that efficiency matters. All those other actions that you might have taken to get in, well, you don't have to do those. Similarly, there's kind of another soft knowledge lock here. If you get into the basement, you can go to the maintenance area. There's like, you have to fight a spider and a rat. But once you do, you get the code word to get into this area. So on your next run, you can go through here and save a couple of steps so you don't have to break the lock. Eventually, though, you do have to get to the back room, and there is a little bit of a puzzle that you need to complete in order to get the Trocket. The puzzle's very bare bones. It's just you need to pick the right selection 5 times. You're guessing a coin flip 5 times, but because this is time wibbly-wobbly shenanigans, the coin always lands the same order each of those times. So your first time here, you might just watch the event unfold, and hopefully you remember the order so that you can come back in on another run and unlock that. There's another similar puzzle with the race where you need to memorize the pattern to get to the lab. You have to make 5 choices in a row to get to there or something like that. And there's a hint on how to do that, but you have to go back to the rooftop to have done that or remember it from the beginning. Even that's not 100% clear because you want to follow the other racers to a point, but at a certain point you want to branch off from there. And I hope it's clear that you want to do that. I tried to hint at that, but it is a little subtle. But anyway, you get to the laboratory and you find there's a mutant bear there who is bumping equipment or something. I'm a little bit nebulous about what he's actually doing there. But anyway, you need to turn off some equipment that has turned itself on or the bear has turned on or something in order to get yourself out of this time loop. So that's kind of the core puzzle box design. There is one optional puzzle back at the casino. To get the password to get into the casino without fighting anybody, you need to get the VIP card. In order to get the VIP card, you have to have a certain amount of money to actually get that. and you can get it one of 3 different ways. If you go into the maintenance room, you'll actually just find, I think, nearly enough money. If you beat up the bouncer, he'll just give you, there'll be enough money that you pull out of his wallet. Or you can pick people's pockets back at the starting line. Then there is also a little bit of a mini game in the casino that you can kind of engage with to earn money. So there's lots of different ways to kind of get to that same result, and I think different players are going to do that different ways. But I definitely wanted to leave it a little bit open. And just having a monetary target and having money be a system that you can pick up from different things kind of helps have multiple options to do the same thing without making the story, too crazy. But if you do engage with the gambling, there's a little bit of a puzzle there where there's some e-sport betting going on, and it's every minute you can place a bet. So you can basically just constantly bet to get money from that. And there's a pattern. You can either do this multiple times and just record what the outcome was for each of these. If you didn't automatically assume that that was the solution, there is actually also a pattern to who wins. So you don't need to necessarily write down all of the possible outcomes. You can just know that certain of the competitors are just better than others and will always win against them. It's just a pure hierarchy, which is pretty simple, but you might have to observe a lot of those to really get that. But that's kind of I put that in as a backstop in case you didn't realize that you could just go back in and memorize it. So anyway, that's kind of how the puzzle box functions. And like I said, certain areas of these I knew I wanted to kind of do pretty early on. But I also knew I wanted to kind of leave things open, but also funnel the player towards the outcome. Because I can't just say at the beginning of this, like, oh, go to the lab and fight a bear. That wouldn't make any sense, and you wouldn't know how to get there, and there's no next step to do that. So that was one of the pieces of feedback that I've gotten from the ludum-dare so far, is folks that are saying that it's a little bit open-ended or a little bit, unclear what to do, and I mean, that's kind of fair, but if I told you what to do, I don't know that it would help. I'd have to really walk you through, but I can't really walk you through what is the best way to do this. There's multiple different paths. This area in particular, this maintenance and basement area, was one thing I added a little bit late because I started designing the game with the student. So I designed their critical path first, and kind of later was like, well, I need another way to kind of get into some of these areas, and the idea of like, okay, I'll just make a basement that connects a bunch of these areas. That'll be convenient. So that's how I designed this puzzle box. So as I was designing the world, I also had to design all of the interactions that you would use to interact with that world, because none of that existed before this. So I started by designing this kind of like card splay as a way to move around the world. And I kind of consistently tried to make it so that when you have these like choices of cards, those are going to take you to another place. But I also wanted to have other interactions with the world, and I could have had just, this is always what it is, you always have multiple cards, but like if you're making a selection, if you're talking to someone, it didn't feel right to me, and it felt like it would be just a menu, like a bad menu. So I want to make it more apparent what the interaction expectations were. So like if I go here, this is just story. There's nothing to click on. I'm presented with this one card, I read it, I click it, and I'm taken somewhere else or something happens. But if I click on here, this is a different interaction where like I just have two choices. What do I want to do? And then kind of very similarly to that, if you enter one of these challenge states, it is actually kind of using the same basic thing, but you are testing one of these skills. Every time you click, it takes a minute, and there's a dice roll behind the scenes that lines up with these. It says whether you pass or fail. I've done very similar skill check systems a number of times before. I'd say this game is definitely inspired by board games, and I definitely thought about other systems for doing like a skill check, but just doing a very, very simple dice roll behind the scenes and not really worrying about the details and just saying you succeed or pass is very simple to implement, but also a lot more clean to explain. Like if this was a real board game, which it in some ways is kind of pretending to be, maybe you might roll dice or something. But to implement that here, you would have to have like dice or something that are shown up on the screen, and how do the numbers align, and what are the systems that underlie that. It's a bit much. When I was originally thinking about the ideas for what I could do before the ludum-dare, I definitely was focused on like, well, what if it's this linear story that you are going through and there's these branching paths. So that's why there's this deck of cards up here, and every time you take an action, it like draws from that deck. And the idea prior to knowing what the theme was like, oh, that'll be cool. I can add stuff to this deck of cards in the future. Some event will happen. But as I was designing it, it turns out that just isn't a thing. It doesn't make sense. It really just doesn't work with this sort of non-linear, like repeating story. There's just not enough time for that to matter. So this is a totally artificial construct up here. There is no actual deck of cards. It is just for appearances. Because I started with that system, it was like, well, I kind of have to do something to make it cohesive. So I want to talk a bit about this. This is Time Stories, the board game. And if you've played Time Stories, the board game, you probably played my game and went, this is very much that game. It is very similar. It plays very similar. There's a lot of overlap, and I did not set out to make a Time Stories game, but it did end up landing very close to that mark. So if you're interested, I'd highly recommend checking out the original cycle. You can probably find it used fairly cheaply. Do a little bit of research and kind of figure out what you're getting into. It is brand new, was not the cheapest thing. And each of these stories is kind of a one and done sort of a thing. You can't really replay it, but it is a fun time. I would encourage you to take a look at that. Okay, so what went well? I would say that working with the scripting language went pretty well overall. When I made that game last year, there were some definite bugs that I had to work out, and there was a couple that were like, oh, I have to debug the compiler to figure this out, and that's not what you want to be doing when you're in the middle of a game jam, trust me. But this time around, there were very few hiccups. There were really only 2 bugs that I ran into that were both pretty easy to work around. So that's good, because this is, the first big test of, the whole programming language. So there's a lot that can go wrong, for sure. Also, what I would think went well is the overall puzzle box design, I think, was pretty solid and worked pretty well. Some of the early feedback indicates that people got through it and people enjoyed it. They did think it was a little aimless at first, but to a certain extent that is kind of necessary. I don't know that I could have changed it in a way that would have made sense without really, giving too much away, I think. And the other thing that I think went well is the interaction of these cards and stuff. I think I really do enjoy more than like if I'd implemented this as like a text adventure game. Because it really is. It could have been implemented like that. But there's really something to like, clicking on these cards and having this nice thing animate and like different interactions, not just being like a pick list in a menu, and having the cards in your hand act as an inventory as opposed to something you have to remember or look at. I think it's a lot more approachable. Having a limited card size to really limit down the amount of text on screen kind of makes it so that you're not too overwhelmed. I mean, some of these are a little bit long, but it is not as bad as like multiple paragraphs of text. So I really do like that, and I like how it turned it out. So what didn't go well? I'd say one of the things is that I was not planning on this taking 72 hours. I was aiming for the 48-hour compo, and it was really apparent on probably Saturday night that it was like, I'm not going to make it. There's too much to do. is kind of the same problem I had on the last ludum-dare, where I had a bunch of missions and things written out, and then building all of that out, building all of the dialogue and stuff. It seems like it should be fast. Every single piece of it goes quickly. But together you realize, like, oh, I just spent an hour doing this one little thing that is, you know, part of this much bigger world, and oh, I have all this polish and other things to do. So by Saturday night, I had maybe this much of the world really built out, and there's still a fair bit of complexity to the stuff that's left. There's, you know, a mini game here, here, and here, effectively, that I hadn't really done. And there were bits in here that I hadn't done as well, like the showing the race from here wasn't done because I hadn't implemented it here, things like that. And one of the tricky things about this kind of like cohesive puzzle box design, especially when it's this kind of open world thing that I was building, is it's really hard to take pieces out without really breaking something. But if I wanted to have all three characters, like I couldn't take this out because this is probably the critical path for one of the characters. And I couldn't take out some of the like side areas because that was important for another character. Like, it worked out in the end, but it's hard to estimate content creation like this for a jam. Like, you build a system and you say like, oh, this is here's the card menu system, and like, okay, that took like 4 or 5 hours, like, but it's good. I'm good. I can build some content that'll go super fast, and it's like it's never that simple. It just isn't. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you have to write, and getting the right tone of voice for all of that writing is hard. Getting the details right, getting all of the connections set up, and like, you know, maybe some of this could have been simplified and I didn't need mini games for some of these pieces, but that wouldn't have felt as cohesive. Like, it kind of needs those little mini games to really kind of be a puzzle. The other thing that I think could have gone better is, like, from the game itself, there's not a great sense of place. Like, right now, it's where is my character? Like, I don't really know where they are. I have this map, but I drew that map after the fact so I could kind of demonstrate and point at things. This was all in my head during the jam. But because there's no art here, and there's not even a title or something saying here is where you are, I think it's a little easy to get lost. I mean, if you get into it, it's a small enough map that I think you can kind of build that map in your head. But I kind of wish you didn't have to. One of the things that Time Stories does really well is that it has cards that represent locations, and it's a little bit analogous, but they have these like really nice artwork for those, and you can kind of see where you are, and there's hints in each of those of what you might find when you start to look at each of those locations. And there was just no time to do anything like that in the compo in the jam with everything else going on. But I think it really adds a lot to the game to know where you are and have that sense of place. At the very least, it would have been nice to have something to indicate where you were. And I did really think about this, like, right at the end, of maybe having a, like, if you pick a card here, it flies to like this area next to the player card, so that, like, you know that's where you are. That was a little trickier than I thought, and it was right at the end. Mainly because you sometimes are navigating to a location not through one of these cards, so it would look cool to just fly to this location and stick there, but sometimes it would have to like come from the deck or something, and it's a little awkward. And really, like, a image portraying the location would be better. Additionally, a map would have probably helped, and earliest like kind of ideas, I was like, oh yeah, I'll make a map card that you click on. That's a bunch of work. A bunch of work. And yeah, I just didn't have time, but something along those lines would have, I think, really helped, and I wish I had time for, but just wasn't there. One other thing that I don't think went too well was, because this is the navigation, this like splay of cards, it kind of limits how many things can be at each location, because really from here, this is a link to another location, and this is a link to another location. So really there's just these like two things at this one location. And if I go to like the Memorial Square at the center, all of these are just off to another direction. There's no central thing. There's nothing here. So I think if I had some more time, what I would do is probably move the like navigation cards to not be cards themselves, and maybe just buttons along the bottom, or like a 4 cardinal directions, and you have your choices for what's in this current location and separately the movement. I don't know if I particularly like either of those, but something else I think would have been better, something along one of those lines maybe. So anyway, I think that's what didn't go well. So to wrap this up, what's next for this game? What am I going to do with it? I don't think I'm going to continue working on it. I think it's fine. There's no one thing that would really set it over the edge. It's, you know, a lot of work, and I think it's mostly in the right place. And I don't want to do too much more exploring of this design space. It was a fun experiment. It was a good test of the scripting language I was building. But I think I'm pretty done with this. I've got other projects to work on. So that's probably what I'm going to do. So anyway, that's my post-mortem for my ludum-dare 47 project. File 47, an incident in the exclusion zone. I hope you enjoyed this, and sorry for the length of this video. I always talk way too much in these, but yeah, till next time. Bye for now.